Well, good morning. It's a treat to be here in London. I want to thank our hosts, Foreign Affairs Chair Kearns, Colonel Stewart, Robert Pittenger, and the Parliamentary Intelligence Security Committee for inviting me to participate in your forum. I've had an opportunity to participate in the forum before in Washington, and it's a real treat to be here in the center of democracy for 900 years and share this time with you. It's true, Robert and I shared some great years together in the House of Representatives, and we worked on the House Financial Services Committee together on the principal issues that this forum, around which it was created. We also had our shared past because we both started our careers in the 1970s in Dallas, Texas, which were formative in both our lives and our financial careers. I want to thank J.C. Boggs and the Forum Board of Directors, too, for helping the Forum grow and prosper and continue to bring this kind of help and a messaging to some 60 countries today. This morning, I want to discuss three principal topics that are interconnected. They're fundamental components of the global growth and prosperous growth that we all want for our globe. They're interconnected and linked to the outstanding two presentations that you just heard from Colonel Stewart on the importance of Taiwan and Taiwan's sovereignty and role in the world, and the importance of the Indo-Pacific as a hub for all of that global growth, and for the outstanding message delivered by Chair Kearns on how we have to work together in this globe to achieve our ultimate objective, which is shared prosperity for all of our citizens. So the first of these three components I want to talk about this morning is the role of the U.S. dollar. Every week we read new headlines, including in this morning's Financial Times, that somehow the dollar is in decline and that its status as the reserve currency for the global economy is under threat. So as this conventional wisdom goes, a growing number of countries are unhappy with the US dollar and the euro and are seeking to set up a parallel payment system with a new currency, a new arrangement, all of their imagination that will represent a credible alternative. The global sanctions imposed on Russia by its neighbors, allies, including the United States, in response to Russia's illegal invasion of sovereign Ukraine, have only fueled this speculation that some countries seek to shift away from the dollar. In fact, earlier this month, Brazilian President Lula da Silva called on the BRICS to create such a common currency. And it's true, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has been trending down over many, many years. But the IMF noted just last year that while 3/4 of that shift away from dollar didn't go to the euro, the yen, or the pound, but in fact went to a variety of smaller currencies like the Canadian dollar, the Swedish krona, and the South Korean won. Not only that, but nearly all commodity contracts, including oil, are still priced and settled in dollars, while again, clearly some countries are seeking and exploring ways to purchase and settle commodity transactions in non-dollar denominations. But let me be frank in front of this group of shared economic policy thinkers. Some countries that are advocating for a non-dollar future are also the promoters of transnational crime, promote unprovoked military action against fellow sovereign nations, operate or provide support to state sponsors of terrorism. And they may well find a common cause in a siren song of an alternative to a dollar global system. But in my view, nations with closed economic systems, restrictions on cross-border capital flows, no freely exchangeable currency, no rule of law, no legal process around which to adjudicate conflicts, no independent central bank, do not, in fact, possess the prerequisite conditions to accomplish such an enormous undertaking as displacing the dollar-based, well-functioning trading and capital market system that the globe has enjoyed now for some 8 decades, despite ups and downs and terrible conflict and bouts of terrible inflation, as we are all experiencing today. Another emerging trend that I read about that is said to challenge the dollar is the just inevitable future, I read in all the financial press, of a surveillance CBDC, a central bank digital currency from China that's just inevitably going to be delivered to you by Huawei and at all of your cell phones. Now, it's true that faster payments are now available, soon 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And in some cases, new blockchain solutions are emerging for digital tokenized payments. That will be a great new additional payment rail for global payment opportunities. And to stay ahead of this, the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union are all working that, in fact, if we're going to use a blockchain, they ought to be done using a private sector-oriented stablecoin. And in the United States, we are engaged right now in creating the regulatory and legal environment for a dollar-based payment stablecoin, which could be used even in that sort of a blockchain environment. Currently, I chair the committee in the House of Representatives that's working on this framework and legislation, and we want to make sure that the U.S. is a leader in that arena. But let me reinforce to this knowledgeable audience that a surveillance CBDC or a assertion that we can make another currency in the world overnight just because we're mad about being sanctioned is not the greatest threat to the dollar-based system. Instead, that threat's in the United States itself. Our failure to craft a sustainable and long-term strategy to rein in out-of-control pandemic-related spending habits and budget deficits would do far more harm to the dollar as a reserve currency than in any of these efforts for de-dollarization through technology or politics. And I hope all of us as parliamentarians recognize the preposterous nature of what was fostered on the global system due to the pandemic, that we can spend all the money we could borrow and there was no consequence of that. In our country, on the left, this is called modern monetary theory, which basically says we can borrow all the money in US dollars and spend it on the citizens of the United States and it has no consequence. That's insane. And that misguided viewpoint is also the kind of viewpoint I see in the leadership at my second point I want to address this morning, and that's reform of the International Monetary Fund. Because those same modern monetary theorists that are trying to change the ordinary laws of supply and demand and economics also are trying to change the International Monetary Fund from a critical element for short-term payment imbalance, short-term exchange concerns in individual countries in our world, and they're trying to change it into a climate bank, while at the same time turning a blind eye to how China makes a mockery of the international process for lending and debt restructuring, particularly for the poorest nations of our world. I believe the IMF is having an identity crisis. It has strayed from its long-standing mission and needs functional governance reform to get back on track. The International Monetary Fund's purpose, as laid out in its charter, is to promote international monetary cooperation through exchange and balance of payments stability. Instead, the fund in the last 2 years has been morphing into a development bank and surrendering to mission creep in areas like climate, even though that's the jobs of the World Bank and the other international financial institutions. This identity crisis is nowhere more evident than in the debate or in and around special drawing rights. My friend Raymond Chistey, member of Parliament here in the United Kingdom, and I have worked on this legislatively in our two respective bodies. We wrote an op-ed published here in the UK about it to call out the IMF for this mistaken approach to financial policy in the globe. The special drawing rights created back in 1969 to supplement long-term global need for central bank reserve assets are now being used to arm countries with short-term spending to address food shortages and rising energy prices. That's not the mission of special drawing rights. Foreign development assistance is best left to foreign development aid organizations, the World Bank, the international financial institutions, working with sovereign governments on a bipartisan basis. The fund should be focused on addressing temporary balance of payments problems and advocating for long-term economic reforms. The lack of guardrails associated with these it's called a general special drawing rights allocation, means that each country can utilize those SDRs for whatever they want, as they see fit, with very limited conditions on how they might be used. And the lack of transparency and any meaningful enforcement in and around that is a real governance gap in the modern international monetary policy. Raymond and I propose concrete changes, legislative changes in our countries, and governance changes on the board of the IMF to impact that. The SDRs have to be allocated in a general allocation across all members, according to their shareholding, which means who benefits from an SDR allocation? The Netherlands, the United Kingdom, the United States, the richest countries in the world are who benefit. Or Iran, Syria, Myanmar, and maybe some countries that are on your list that you don't think need more access to cash. That's bizarre. It wasn't intended that way 60 years ago, but the results are troubling to me now. And if we're serious about those governance changes, I think we should do the hard work. We should ask the IMF Board of Directors to do the tough job of getting a consensus, a majority, and that we should target SDRs so they actually help low-income countries, and that we would do that by a target of a special allocation, not a general allocation. And that way we can specifically help those 80 countries in desperate need under the IMF's rules for additional reserve assets for long-term balance of payment support, and not deliver cash in the central bank account to Iran or Syria or North Korea, not North Korea, they're not a member, but the people who are a part of the IMF who from time to time stray from the global mission of a rules-based order. The landscape of sovereign lending requires the IMF's more direct intervention. And the G20 has had this as a topic, and the G20 has had conversations about it, and the finance ministers talk about it and write about it in the public statements associated with G7 meetings and the like, but we're not making enough progress fast enough. China's now the largest creditor in the world. Their terms are not transparent. Their terms are for them. We'll make this loan, deliver to you a bridge that collapses in a few years, but we've got your oil assets. Might have a port facility. Might build a road to a community college that you built, maybe in a city that I visited not long ago on the equator. It looks like the University of California at Santa Barbara. It's on a green hillside. It's a beautiful facility, white concrete. As you get closer and closer and closer and closer, there are no windows, there are no doors, there are no people there. It's just white concrete buildings built by Chinese labor in a country on the equator, on the continent of Africa, that the country has now pledged assets for, that it serves no economic basis whatsoever. Now, there's a wake-up out there, and I hear it when I travel. Was just in Rome, 31 countries in Rome, most from Africa. I hear it. The Africans are asking for help. That help needs to be delivered by the men and women who are at work in the G7 and other countries to reform the IMF. The IMF should not lend money until they get transparent terms and that we see the full picture of the predatory lending that has been done by China across this world. In my view, as a result of the last 15 years of so-called Belt and Road, China has not been a responsible creditor, and its resistance to continue reform ideas, either the G20 ideas or the ideas that Raymond and I have outlined in our work, in my view, personal view, not a view of the United States, they have not earned that merited increase in a bigger voice and a bigger responsibility in the multilateral organizations. Shareholding in one of our multilateral institutions, foundational, as the chairwoman said, to a rules-based system for 8 decades is more than money. It's about a commitment to multilateral cooperation, not just the size and scope of a nation. So until China gets serious about coming to the table and acting more like a responsible member of the international community, including in its role as a creditor nation, I believe they ought to understand that many others in the international community will continue to object to that point of view until they see a more responsible, transparent use of their leadership. Let me turn to my third and final point about how we work together in economics for a brighter future. I want to talk about Ukraine. Last month, the White House asked the Congress for an additional $24 billion in supplemental assistance to support Ukraine in its effort to eject Putin's illegal invading army that's now crafted a mined trench warfare system longer than the Maginot Line in World War I. This was met with pushback from some in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, which consistently has asked the Biden administration for full accountability on where each aspect of the funding that we've allocated so far has gone, and also particularly show us transparently how American contributions for humanitarian purposes, military purposes, and Ukraine monthly budget support compare to our European and Asian allies. Some people were pessimistic about that, but I call your attention just last month to votes in the House where members offered amendments to the National Defense Authorization Bill to limit spending for ejecting Vladimir Putin from Ukraine, or calling for a different form of accountability about that spending. Those amendments were rejected by overwhelming numbers on a bipartisan basis in the House. The United States is committed to the global mission of ejecting Putin's army from Ukraine. Those House Republicans are well aware that the Munich-style appeasement of Putin by the Obama administration and some here in Europe led to the takeover of Crimea, the vicious chemical weapons attacks and barrel bomb destruction of Syria in support of Assad, and ultimately this invasion of Ukraine. And that's why, in my view, you saw that overwhelming rejection of those amendments in July that would have rolled back American support for Ukraine. However, this supplemental request comes at a time where there's serious concern and debate, as I said, about overall spending in the United States and the level of budget deficits. And that's why I'll conclude with my legislation that I've been working on that I need all of your support for in each of your nations. It's called the Ukraine Reconstruction Act. It gives the President of the United States authority to seize and transfer title of Russian sovereign assets within U.S. jurisdiction into an international fund for the sole purpose of Ukraine's eventual reconstruction and humanitarian relief. The idea is simple. Russia should be responsible for the long-term costs stemming from its illegal invasion of Ukraine, not British, Japanese, or American taxpayers. This approach was crafted to be consistent with United States policy and international law, including the respect for the territorial integrity of states and the human rights of individuals. It's also consistent with international precedent where the U.S. has worked with international partners to establish a precise fund like this that we saw in Afghanistan in 2002, the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal in 1981, and the UN Compensation Fund for Kuwait following Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1991. Considering most Russian sovereign assets are located outside of the United States, though, it's important for our partners to recognize that they need to introduce and pass similar legislation in each of their jurisdictions, because the United States is not in a capacity to act in their countries. This policy builds on the generosity and solidarity of the 59 nations who gathered here in London 2 months ago and pledged $60 billion for recovery and reconstruction for Ukraine. The approach goes well beyond the long-tailed, complex legal battle that we'll have on this issue that you've read so much about, the oligarch assets. The attempt to turn oligarch assets into money that could be used for Ukrainian reconstruction is a long road, filled with years of litigation. And we would be better spent if our treasuries and finance ministries and leaders focused on how to find the Russian sovereign assets controlled by the Russian Federation in each of our jurisdictions and use those as the bargaining chip. So these three interconnected things are about working together for a more prosperous future under a rules-based system that Chair Kern so beautifully outlined. I'm so grateful to share this time with you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be together. I thank my friend Robert Pittenger for the introduction. And again, thank you, Robert, for bringing like-minded people together to solve challenges that we face.